So this text is Salatul Muqarrabin. It's available online if anyone wants to cover it, but it's in Arabic. It's taught by Habib Hussein al-Saqaf, and it's also taught by Habib Muhammad al-Saqaf, and they've both taught it in depth. Habib Muhammad's class is 20 classes, and Habib Hussein's is a 6-part lesson that's broken into parts. So this text is written by Hasan ibn Salih al-Aydurus al-Bahr al-Jifri, who lived in the year 1191 after Hijrah, and he was known for his knowledge, piety, abstinence, helping the poor, and mending relations. And they say this text it's a very small text when you see it. It's very thin, but it carries quite enormous benefit. Its importance that this is the heart of Islam, the absolute core of Islam, how one connects to one's creator in the 5 prayers. And this is part of the 5 pillars, so you can understand the importance of it. It's also mentioned in these 2 verses of the Quran where it's mentioned in many places, but these 2 the teacher emphasizes. قد أفلح بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم قد أفلح المؤمنون الذين هم في صلاتهم خاشعون. So it describes how is the believer in their prayer. They're khashia. So what does khashia mean in English, right? It's somebody who has that absolute awe and reverence and, deep contemplation, before their Lord. It's not somebody who is, thinking of other things, which, a lot of people actually do, right? If you're not in that state. So when you compare where's your prayer to this description of how it's described in the Quran, it makes you stop and think, right? How is my prayer and how is it described in the Quran, and how can I reach that level of being of someone who has khushu' in their prayer? The second verse that's mentioned, وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةَ لِذِكْرِي. So that one stands for the prayer to make remembrance of me, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is part of when we pray, that it's to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that, again, it goes back to what we are thinking about in the prayer, right? Here, and then it talks about the outward and inward dimensions of the prayer, that one is busied with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at that time, that when you're in the prayer, that one is fully engaged with the prayer, that there's no room for other thoughts or other things to enter into the prayer, or even one's surroundings when you're praying, that it's no longer of importance because you're completely busied and engaged with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They say that the prayer is characterized by 5 things. And that's ta'zeem, hayba, khawf, raja, and haya min Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ta'zeem, understanding the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hayba is it's like awe, isn't it? Awe? Anyone has a different one? The glory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Khawf is fear. Raja is hope. Haya min Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like having that shyness that you're standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That in the prayer, one is longing for paradise, and that one understands the importance of striving to be of the foremost. And it also talks about in the text how a lot of people spend a lot of time purifying their outward image before people, but not many people spend a lot of time, or a lot of people neglect their inward state. So if one is, one has to make time to really think deeply about this matter of how they approach the prayer and how they approach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at these 5 particular times of the day. And to strive to improve that, and not to, the outward is also important, that we're following the outward rules of the Sharia, but there's also this very inward aspect that that what one does, that one is driven, purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to do what's pleasing to Him and do things in the best of ways, right? It mentions in another part, it'll come that, the prayer, it's like how you present it before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's almost like a beautiful garment, right? And you prepare it and you box it nicely when you want to give someone a gift, and then you present it in the right way. But when you don't pray in the right way, they say it's as if you're taking, you're saying it's a garment, but it's an old, ragged, dirty garment, right? And it's thrown at the person, and you're saying this is the gift. So they say this is the analogy to think of, okay, well, how good is my prayer and what I'm offering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when I make time to pray? And he mentions in the text that we need to have a pure heart, a pure intention, and a resolve to implement, a desire to take of this knowledge, and a brokenness before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that one realizes that despite all of our faults, despite of, how many mistakes we make in the day, from, even hour to hour, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala graces us with that desire to improve and to turn towards Him. Because that desire only comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not from us, not, oh, now I'm a person of knowledge and I realize I should, fix myself up. That drive to improve yourself, that itself is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that gift from Him, is a blessing in itself. Despite our bad, how deficient we are, yet He's still, the most merciful and the most generous to us in having us turn towards Him. So this book, it starts with the wudu, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go over this really quick. This is a quick version of this text, but it's a very deep text that I do recommend people take, inshallah, at some point, when you're able to. So it starts with the wudu, and it says that this is the key to the prayer, that the best time for the wudu is actually before the prayer time comes in, that one's ready, one's looking forward to the prayer. You see the time is about to come in, so you're ready in a state of wudu. So you're ready and waiting for the prayer. The benefit of that, they say that it creates less waswasa in the prayer, that less thoughts come to you when you're in a state of wudu and ready for the prayer, that there's more reward, that you are keen and avid for the prayer and waiting for the prayer to come in. They say that the angels ask for your forgiveness. It says that it also breaks hardness of heart. What keeps you from hardness of heart is, they define it as, when you're just, you're no longer able to cry over your faults, that you're just, your faults, but yeah, it just doesn't bother you anymore. That's hardness of heart. So they say when you make wudu before the time, that helps to soften the heart. And it also mentions general benefits. They say that there's a hadith, the wudu is the key to the prayer. And it's the key. They say that because it's the key to concentration in the prayer, that the prayer starts at this time, before you're preparing yourself mentally that I have to pray. There's the supplications that we covered in the beginning of guidance, of that you can say at the different parts of the wudu, so that you're in a state of mindfulness even during the wudu, that you're not, as we know when we've covered in the books of fiqh, I know you've covered it in steps class, that there's no talking during the wudu, because they say the wudu itself is an act of worship, so that one should be in a state of contemplation, and not be just talking. That's why you shouldn't be talking to people. It's an act of ibadah, and then it has those many beautiful du'as that one remembers at the time as one's doing the wudu, that either you've memorized those du'as and you're saying them, or at least if you can't do that, just know the meanings and then just make the du'a in your own words, right, for the exact same thing. So when you're washing your hands, you're making an inward du'a that, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wipe out any sins you've committed with your hands. When you're rinsing the mouth, that you're forgiven for any of the sins of the tongue, things you've said without thinking. You know, when you're rinsing the nose, they say that you're protected from smelling the fire, the smoke of hellfire. Washing the face, that you're, you know, recognized as a believer on the day of judgment. And so it goes on, like all the supplications. If you can't memorize it, you can at least know the general meanings and make dua from your heart for those things. So you're in a state of contemplation during the wudu. And they also mention the example of Sayyidina Ali and Zayn al-Abidin, may Allah be pleased with them, that when Sayyidina Ali, when the time for prayer came, they say that he used to become very quiet and pale and almost be trembling. And when people would ask him, what is with you, he would say that, do you not know who I'm about to stand before? That it would be something that would shake him, right? So, you know, continually when you hear these examples and these stories, it's almost like a mirror that shows you, you know, we're the righteous people with regard to their prayer, and then it forces you to contemplate, like, where are you with your prayer? So that, you know, you strive, like, not to be indifferent to these things, that one strives to improve these matters. And then for starting the prayer, in the text, Habib Hussein, he mentioned this one thing that always stuck out in my mind about the removing the shoes when you enter, you know, a place of worship. You know, like even Seekers Hub, when you come here, people remove their shoes. That it's not about cleanliness of the carpet because people pray here. They also mention that it's out of awe and reverence for, you know, the knowledge that you're going to obtain in these places, right? That you have that awe. You're very conscious of where you're going. You remove your shoes, and that's out of, you know, you recognize that you're entering a place that you're directing yourself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he mentions the parallel between the story of Musa when he's about to enter the valley of Tuwa, and he's asked to remove his shoes before he enters. So it's not just about cleanliness. And that always stuck out, that when you remove your shoes at any kind of like Islamic center, to make that intention before you go in, that you're removing your shoes and you're intending to direct yourself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when you're in this place. And that's why they say that, you know, the adab in places like this is so critical, because you're entering a place where, you know, this is the nature of the facility, that it's a place where people are all striving to direct themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so there's a certain etiquette for when you're in that place, and that's something that we should even guide our children to doing, that it's not a place to run, or, you know, it's a place, you know, of calmness and sakina, that, you know, and contemplation as well. So, okay, so then when we hear the iqama, the author reminds us that we should remember, when you hear the iqama, that one day you're going to be called before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that same calling out, and then it's going to be time to stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you hear the iqama, that it should shake you, or even the adhan, that remember that you're going to be called. And he says, how many times has he called you? And your head was heavy and stepped slow, that it was time for the prayer, and you were, you know, just lazily like, oh, do I really have to get up? And you're sort of forcing yourself and lazy, right? And, you know, thinking that this is who is the caller, right? When we were acting, you know, with such poor adab before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we need to reflect on that, and then, you know, strive to rectify ourselves for the future. And he also mentioned how that we should feel shy of his gaze upon our heart. So at those moments, recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his gaze was on your heart, and he saw that from you at that time. Also, when we say the takbir, that one gathers one's heart. They say that it's as if you see Jannah on your right, the fire on your left, and the sirat in front of you. That you remove all thoughts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before you even raise your hands for that takbir. And then you direct yourself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with, you have that utter humility and shyness, realizing who are you about to stand before, that you're completely facing Him with all of one's being. That means you're not distracted in the least with anything of the dunya or anything you're involved with, or work or family or whatever. It's not in your mind, that you're completely directed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they say it's almost a sense of that you're leaving the dunya at that moment. When you're saying Allahu Akbar, you're exiting from the dunya and you're entering into almost a different realm where you're just connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you have that humbleness to realize that He has permitted you to stand before Him, before you. So you're standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They also say that it's almost like you're surrendering all your affairs. Like they say, like if there's a hold up, that you raise your hands like I give up kind of thing. They say when you do the takbir, that it's the same sentiment, that you're surrendering all of your affairs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They even say, it's not written here, that it's almost as if you're throwing all of the affairs or worries in your mind behind you. So in this action of saying Allahu Akbar and raising your hands, it's as if you're throwing all of that behind you, and now you're facing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they say also to reflect on the meaning of just saying those words, those two words, Allahu Akbar, reflecting on that meaning, that He is greater than anything your mind can think of or be distracted by. And that you feel that utter humility and lowness before the King of Kings. And then he also mentioned the importance of that you're pronouncing it correctly. And then it talks about the Fatiha, and it's almost a supplication that you're asking for the straight path. So to have that foremost in your mind, that you're saying it with sincerity, like may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide you to the straight path. That may you have adab with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by reflecting on the meanings of these verses. It's not just something you say wrote, the Fatiha. It has a great meaning. So you should reflect on that meaning with every verse that you're saying and know the meaning. And it talks about how you should recite slowly and address Him with the utmost respect and humility, and feeling your neediness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it's only if He guides you to the straight path that you have that straight path. So it's that deep asking of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide you to the straight path. And there he is talking about that analogy I mentioned earlier about as if it's a garment that you're offering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one should reflect on how is the prayer that one is offering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It also talks about the importance of having presence in the prayer, and that was one section that really got me, because he said to reflect, how old are you? You know, how many years have you been praying, and how have you been praying all of these years? And then reflecting on that you know, some of us have been praying for decades, you know, just reciting, you know, or maybe there's some of us here who, you know, even left the prayer for a few years, right? And you just didn't have that understanding of what it was that you were missing. You know, that sweetness of that discourse with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, so just reflecting on that and that disrespect, and then that feeling should drive you, you know, to be a person who's going to rectify themselves. He mentions that you know, to think about the disrespect it is of how could one be addressing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you're thinking of other things, or you're thinking of aspects of the dunya. That this is, you know, the ultimate kind of insult, that they say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turns to a person, but then when he gazes into their heart and sees something else, that he turns away. So it's something to address. And then just outside of the text, like ways to sort of address that with yourself. If you find that you're a person who continuously gets distracted in the prayer, sometimes one of the things that can be distracting you is if you're involved in too much, you know, especially in the West, there's a lot of, like, I'd almost call it marketing noise. There's always something playing. There's like, you're bombarded in many aspects, like be it the internet, texting, flyers, like radio, like there's always stuff that's there to fill your mind, and you'll find when there's moments of silence that these are the things that start to bother you, right? So when you start to cut these out and just enjoy, you know, moments of tranquility or silence like that, especially, you know, at times like when we've talked about, I'm sure Ustadha Amjad has talked about when you know, waking up for the tahajjud prayer, you know, in your home, and it's just that quietness, right? You know, these are the things that help to almost quell the mind so that it helps you to reduce that noise, you know, so that, you know, we're people who have adab when we stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I have to turn off my phone. Sorry, I didn't turn off my phone. Okay, so they mention that one should have this longing for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how is that defined? That one's heart trembles when he's mentioned, that one's eyes fill with tears, your skin pales, your head lowers, and your gaze is humbled. And the teacher, he asked us to reflect, have you ever lost sleep over this? You know, that longing for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that, you know, it even prevents you from sleeping, that you want to just go and be with him and just, you know, pray. Like, have you ever lost sleep over that? And then he said to reflect, you know, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pleased with you? Would he love to meet you? And, you know, to strive, you know, to be one of these kind of people. He mentioned that the best praise is to say, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All praises to Allah, Lord of the worlds. And this is the speech of the people of paradise. It's repeated throughout the Quran. And that one should say this in all of one's states. And there's the famous story of the poor man in Baghdad meeting the... I've heard this, you've heard it before, because I think I've heard Ustadha Amjad say it before. But just the idea of this wealthy, arrogant man seeing a poor... you know, destitute person on the side of the road who's just saying Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah, and he's like, for what are you saying Alhamdulillah? What do you have? You've got nothing. You're dirty. You're alone. You don't even have health. You're sick, and you just keep saying Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah. What is this? And the poor man answers him, but he says, I've got something that you don't have. And the wealthy man in his arrogance says, what could you possibly have that I don't have? And he says that I have the praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on my tongue. So, and then it's not just with the tongue, it's in the heart, that one is thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for whatever one is given. And I don't mean to be like, what's the word? Like that one should be overwhelmed with one's shortcomings and how they're not standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the best of ways. But because one is thankful for all of their states, and you know, you have the chance to improve yourself with every day that comes, that each day you can start over. And they say it's not even a matter of starting over from each day, it's from even, you know, hour to hour, moment to moment. One can, you know, intend that, you know, from this moment onwards, you know, like from the moment I, you know, even get up from this majlis, I'm going to resolve to change my ways and to strive to like rectify myself, to put my affairs in order, and you're rewarded for these intentions. So I don't mean to come off as, you know, what's the word, like it's to be overwhelmed with one's faults. It's you can always, you know, strive, and that's what we're accountable for at the end of the day, is that we did our best, you know, and that we really strive with everything we had. And inshallah, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees that, and then He can grant you tawfiq in what comes to you, you know, even whether it be, you know, more knowledge, you know, or a better intention, or you're more striving in the deen. All of these things, they're blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They don't come from us anyway. So, you know, to be somebody who's, they say, knocking at the door, you know, you're always asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for these things, you know, and not busied with other things that you're a person of distraction. They mention in the text also that the outward positions of the prayer, that the standing, the bowing, the prostration, those in themselves lead to these aspects of the heart. It leads to humility, reverence, and it has a great effect on the heart. No, I don't want a new note. Okay, then it talks about bowing. How are we doing for time? We're okay. For bowing, it talks about the outward form and the inward form, that you're bowing over to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that teaches humility, right? That you're bowing over to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That they say that when you bow, that you're bowing with all of your being. It's not just your, like a physical bowing, it's all of you, like bowing towards your Creator. And they even mention that you can feel that when you're doing that bowing, that all of creation is bowing with you towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which it does at every moment. That when you're bowing, that you're seized with awe, and you have that humility before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that complete veneration of Allah, your Creator, the one who created you, when you're bowing. He mentions also in the text that when you say Subhana Rabbi al-Azim, yeah, notice the ya, you can't see it on the diagram, but maybe circle it on your diagram. Rabbi. Ra, ba, ya. Because what they mention in the text is that, or at least in the class, I can't remember if it's in the text, it's one of the Habib mentioned, that they have that, you know, that humility, that when they're even saying that, Subhana Rabbi al-Azim, that the people of righteousness, they even shudder at that, because how could the word Rabb, which means Lord, be connected with that damir, the ya? The ya is for me, Rabbi, my Lord. So the ya is from, you know, us as limited creation. How could it be connected with the word Rabb? So they almost shy from saying that, you know, the Subhana Rabbil Azim, like how could that small ya be connected with the Lord, you know, subhanallah. And then there's the supplication that one can say for the Nawafil prayer, at least in the Hanafi school, you know, when they're bowing, besides Subhana Rabbil Azim. And then he said, when it's time to raise your head, have that feeling that it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who's permitting you to now raise your head. When you say Sami Allahu liman hamida, and that you're saying, and then Rabbana lakal hamd, that these are words that you say from the depth of your heart and your soul, and from the core of your very being. For the prostration, and then it mentions other supplications you can say in the prostration, and I believe again that's for the Nawafil in the Nafil prayers, for at least in the Hanafi school. I'm not sure about. I don't know anything about the Shafi'i school, but they're all Shafi'i, so it's probably like the same. And then it talks about the optional supplications you can do. And they say that one is forgiven for sins the longer one prostrates. So one could continue to say, Subhana Rabbil Ala. We're talking about the prostration now. Yeah, Subhana Rabbil Ala. So you can continue to say Subhana Rabbil Ala, and then their sins are forgiven the longer one prostrates. As long as one doesn't forget. The important thing to remember if one does that is that you don't forget where you are in the prayer, because you can forget, you know, where you are. So not to the state of losing sight of where you are at, but one can prolong that. And it mentioned the importance of repenting for, the sins that you know about, but there's also the sins you don't know about, the things we do out of ignorance on a daily basis. And then again, the Subhana Rabbil Ala, it has that the of, Rabbi, my Lord. And so to be aware of that and have that humility when you're saying that. Again, and it's said from the heart. And that's one of the things Habib Hussein said that I always remember, is that he said, if you don't have the adab to have presence during the prayer, can you at least have it when you're in sujood before your Creator? That's the very least that one should have, that when you're in prostration, at least have your presence of heart at that time. And have that feeling that you're prostrating your soul before your Creator. And it talked about when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about abdi in the Quran, my servant, when he's talking about my servant, that in these two verses, go in amongst my servants and into my garden, and he's talking about my servants. And you will have this verse, I personally think a lot about, when that there are a certain group of believers that the shaitan doesn't have power over. It says, you will have no power over my servants, only over the ones who go astray and follow you. So this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala referring to his servants. So to be somebody, I remember what he was talking about. When you say Subhana Rabbil Ala, that you're saying my Lord, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then to certain believers, he responds referring to them as abdi, that they're my servants. And this is how they're referred to in the Quran. If you're one of the true servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that even the shaitan doesn't have power over such believers. So to strive for that station. And that in the sujood, that one should feel that state of tranquility descending over one, that this is the fullest extent of lowering oneself before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're in a full state of surrender, both outwardly in that sujood, but also inwardly. Like there's no further way you can put yourself lower before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they say that with this, that veils are removed and one increases in humility, that, realizing who you're prostrating before, that he is the King of Kings, and your heart is completely there and present within that sujood. And they mentioned about how the person cries out of that longing for their Creator when they're alone, that you have that longing for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are moments of sweetness that one that enjoys and looks forward to, that time with their Creator. And he asked us to reflect on the prostration of the magicians to Allah before Fir'aun. And we know in that famous story when the magicians realized that their snakes weren't, there was just magic, but there was a real Lord, that they fell down in prostration, and that resulted in a complete change. They fell down in prostration, and so he was asking us to reflect, what kind of prostration were they in? They fell into prostration, and from that, they didn't even care about Fir'aun after that. They were just, they knew the truth, and that's all that mattered. So he said to reflect on that prostration. They say that it has an effect on the ground when one prostrates, that the ground loves you and it cries over your death when you pray in certain places, especially on a repeated basis, that part of the ground will cry after you pass away. And it mentioned the significance of the 7 parts of the body that touch the ground when you're in prostration, and that these parts don't burn in the fire. And they say the wisdom of that is these are the most sensitive parts of the body as well. The forehead and nose, the 2 hands, 2 knees, feet. He also mentioned the importance of saying the takbir at the right time. That's more of a fiqh principle, that you don't say it too late or too soon when you're going down for the prostration, so that you're in a state of dhikr as you're going down. And he mentioned that people will be standing or prostrating out of thankfulness on the Day of Judgment. So to be of one of those people that are prostrating out of thankfulness on the Day of Judgment, he said that in this world you should be somebody who regularly performs Salatul Shukr. You know, being this 2 rak'ah of thankfulness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for your blessings. And then when you're in the sitting position, it talked about the proper way of sitting, and the Salatul Ibrahimiyya, and that this is, remember, this is the best praise of the Prophet ﷺ, and that you're supplicating after this. And then when you turn in sanams, that once you're surrendering your prayer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and at that time he says to reflect that you will, one day you're going to surrender your soul, and reflect on your state as you end the prayer, because this is the state of your soul as you end the prayer. This is a reflection of your state on the Day of Judgment. So like if you're a person of like heedfulness, that inshallah it's, you know, glad tidings. But if you're, you know, a person who's rushing on to the next thing, you know, it's time to stop and, you know, just strive to rectify that. And then he talked about the supplication after the prayer, that one should take time for that. They say that when you're sitting with your beloved, that it's not something you rush away from, that you should enjoy that time, that you're still your supplications after the prayer, that this is also a time of sweetness. It's not something you abruptly turn away from and get up and go and do the next thing, that you long to stay in that state and in a state of remembrance. And there's some more details there, but we're going to end soon. So the conclusion was just that we should repent for not praying with presence in the past. You know, thinking about how your prayer has been in the past, you know, calculate how old you are, and if you've, you know, for the people, there's some kids here, my kids are here, so for at least the rest of us who have reached the state of maturity, how many years have you been praying that you've been accountable? And how have you been praying? And to repent for that time, and, you know, strive to change how you pray, you know, from, you know, the next prayers going forward, or for moment to moment, or even for myself, because I covered this a while ago. I was just, you know, I was thinking it's a blessing Sheikh Ustadha Amjad wasn't here, because I don't think I would have opened my book to review. So it was a blessing for me that I had to review, you know, think about this again. It's something that you return to again and again. It's again, how often do we check our appearance in the mirror, you know, to see how do we look before we go out, but how often do we check, you know, our appearance, you know, of where we should be at, like almost spiritually, right? And then strive to adjust that. It's a very important thing. So reflect on your age, how much time has passed you in heedlessness. Reflect on your station on the Day of Judgment, what it could potentially be if you remain in a state of heedlessness and just day to day, that one should be striving with every day to rectify themselves and be a better person than they were the day before. And that one should renew one's intention to strive one's utmost to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that returns to the importance of seeking knowledge, all of this, that with knowledge, it helps you to have that adab before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because without knowledge, we remain, you know, in a state of heedlessness, and, you know, even a heedlessness of knowing that we're in a state of heedlessness, right? We don't even recognize that we don't know anymore. So it's something to strive for with all of one's, you know, time as it permits, you know, according to whatever, you know, other engagements we have in the dunya. And as he said, to strive to be increased in presence. Don't be satisfied with a small portion. That maybe you have, you know, aspects of having that state of remembrance, but not continuously. So always strive to improve that and improve your prayer on a, from prayer to prayer. And to be grateful for the blessing that realize He has allowed for you, the blessing of the prayer, and being grateful for His generosity despite one's low state. Those who thank will be increased, that you thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for whatever you've been given. Even just for being somebody who's keen to pray, even if you didn't have like a state of, these great states that these righteous people have, that even if we didn't have that, be thankful for what you've been given. Even just going through the motions, that's something to be thankful for, or even a slight bit of remembrance. That's everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives is something to be grateful for, and never to feel that any deficiency has, that He has left you. It's rather we need to strive on our part to be better people from every moment that we have. They say even from prayer to prayer, like, strive to improve yourself, before, Dhuhr comes in today, and then before Asr comes in, strive to rectify yourself, that before Asr comes in, that you're continuously striving for that improvement. So that's basically the text, and our time is up. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us to be people of remembrance, and to have the adab when we stand before Him, and to help us to be people of remembrance. May we be in a state that is pleasing to Him, and may He forgive us for our many, many shortcomings that we do, both knowingly and unknowingly. And we ask Him for His forgiveness and His rahmah and His lutf. Subhanallah wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Jazakallahu khairan.